the thing about running a government is that there are quantitative, measurable indicators of success or failure, and we can look at those measures. There also is the felt reality of just being a person who's living in the world. And sometimes those things come apart. And sometimes the way that your perception, the way that you feel, the way that you individually are impacted when you go to the grocery store, when you fill up your gas tank, there's a way that you feel as an individual. And the way that you feel as an individual is not always necessarily represented in the big data analytics and the big measures of success. This is something that I know really well as a cancer patient. I am living in a way that it does not cohere with the population statistics or something like this. Listen, I've outlived a prognosis a couple of times. So I'm intimately familiar with what the statistics say and then what my lived reality is. And I don't want to cheapen your lived reality. I want to see you exactly what your struggles are, what your challenges are, what your, the day-to-day things that you face that you need to overcome. It's important that we live into those realities. But it's also important that we have kind of a macro view where at least we're somewhat informed in the mechanisms of governance and we're somewhat informed in some of the economic indicators. Something that I continue to see is that people talk about how disastrous the last 4 years have been. I get this in comments when I talk about, President Biden and that administration. People will say, well, nothing could be any worse than how the last 4 years have been. That just it's not borne out by the macro level statistics. Now, I know that that's different from the way that you feel day to day. So I'm not trying to cheapen your experience. But I think also part of us all coming together here, and this is what I'm calling for, is something that transcends party lines. Something that says, listen, if you are like me, then, you're probably earning whatever, maybe somewhere between 50K and 100K annually in your salary, or maybe your joint salary if you're a two-income family or something like this. If you're in this just kind of like middle class, working class sort of income, socioeconomic category, all of us are just trying to get by, not be house poor, being able to go to the grocery store and feed our families and stuff. You and I are like in the same reality on that. If we're neighbors, if our kids are at the same public school, we're locked in the same. And we're so much similar. We have so much more in common than any of us have in common with, the incoming administration. That just is the reality, that the president-elect Trump's cabinet picks are billionaires and TV stars. And that just isn't our life. So we just need to be able to talk about that. And, if your response to that, I've talked about this and people have said, well, yeah, well, they're billionaires and they're good at business. And so we want them in charge. So that's a perspective you can take. I don't have a lot of trust in the billionaire class. I don't think that they have any knowledge of what my day-to-day life is like. And so I'm pretty skeptical that they can represent me in policymaking. But that's my position, and I can hold that position and you can hold a position that's different from that. That's okay. But, I continue to see people say things like, well, the last 4 years have been disastrous and the Biden administration has been a complete failure. It just hasn't been. Even if you felt the pressure of inflation in your life, it hasn't been a disaster. It hasn't been a failure. In fact, there's been a lot of legislative action that's been taken. And starting with right when he got in office, the American Rescue Plan. And there was a bipartisan infrastructure bill. And there's been the NEVI program to build EV charging stations around the country. There's been the CHIPS and Science Act that has sought to bring microprocessor manufacturing back to America. There's been the PACT Act that has looked to expand veteran benefits. These have been real packages that have really been passed, that are really being implemented, that are really being funded at the state level. There's just no disputing that. You can disagree with those policies. That's fine. That's what's great about America. That's what's great about First Amendment protection, is that we are protected to criticize the government. But this idea that the Biden administration has been a failure or a disaster, that's just divisive rhetoric. And it just isn't true. It just isn't the case. You can say, so what President-elect Trump is offering are lower taxes for the corporate class, lower taxes for the wealthy, corporate taxes, they're like at 28%, and then he got them to 21%. Now he wants to get them to 15%. So we'll be living in a reality where the wealthy class and the corporate class will be taxed on a lower percentage than what everyday middle class Americans are taxed. Now, you may be okay with that. You may say, hey, well, that's trickle down, or that makes sense, or we want to give tax breaks to the wealthy and the corporate class because then that's going to be job creation. I disagree with that economic analysis, but it certainly is something you can. I mean, all the way back to Reagan, that's been a thing that people have talked about. So it's not illegitimate to hold that position. It's a position that I would disagree with, but it's not illegitimate. But the reality is we got to be clear-eyed. We got to be able to have truthful conversations. We have to be able to say the Biden administration, while we may disagree with it, it was not a failure. It was not a disaster. And the same thing about President-elect Trump policies. You may be for mass deportation. You may be for, tax breaks for the corporate class. You may be for deregulation. You may be for taking a hard look at vaccinations and vaccine mandates and things like this. You are every bit within your right to hold that position. But I just think we've got to be able to have fact-based conversations about policies and about the way that everyday Americans are impacted. Because anything that benefits corporate class or billionaire class is likely not to benefit me. And I don't want to live in a country where I, as a middle-class American, am taxed at a higher percentage than are wealthy billionaires in the corporate class. That's the position that I hold. You don't have to hold that position, but I do think we need to be able to just kind of grow up and to have fact-based conversations about the policies that the Biden administration did get through Congress and did sign into law and are now really benefiting everyday Americans. We've got to be able to say that. And you need to be able to say that. That doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden a Biden fan, but it does mean that, like Biden has said, we can't be Democratic only when our candidates win, right? We've got to be able to be clear-eyed about the last 4 years. Even the points on which you disagree, we still need to be clear-eyed. And it just is inaccurate to say it's been a disaster or a failure.